Well, good morning. Back in college, if you have been around, you might know this, but I actually double majored in business and religion. I started as a business major and then ended up picking up religion. But to be honest, despite beginning to feel called towards ministry and enjoying my ministry classes, my highest grades were in my finance and economics classes. It turns out I just loved that stuff and ate it up. And so ever since then, I think I've enjoyed following along a little bit on the news and about how the markets are doing or what's going to happen. And of course, it's fascinating right now. It's anyone's guess as to what has happened. There's always analysis of what has happened, but different interpretations of that analysis, right? And then there's predictions about the future. And these people, they get on there and they're so confident. They exude confidence about what's going to happen next. And let me just say this: if they were actually really accurate, they wouldn't be on the news. They would need to be on the news because everyone would just follow them and do exactly what they say. But it never stops them, right? The best they can do is kind of look at what has happened and kind of analyze where we are right now a little bit and then make predictions about the future and kind of hope things turn out that way. And unfortunately, sometimes I would argue the cultural understanding of Jesus, not necessarily like those who study the Bible or read the Bible or try to understand it in its context, but just the general idea of Jesus is Jesus went and got himself crucified. He was a good guy. He taught. He loved people well. He cared for people. Maybe he did some miracles, but he taught a lot of good things. And then, lo and behold, those guys arrested him, and he was beaten, and they nailed him to a cross, right? That's the cultural understanding of what happened to Jesus. But that's an utter failure to understand what Jesus was doing through all of that, right? To miss the idea that through the Gospel of John, even as we have read, is there even a hint that Jesus is like, I don't know what's going to happen, right? No, it's one after another. It is him just constantly telling his disciples, pointing to the cross, pointing to what was going to happen to him. And through one of the clues is through the whole Gospel of John is the phrase, the hour, right? The hour. Early on in John 4, when he was at the wedding at Cana, and his mom came to him and said, "They've run out of wine. It's still got days left in the wedding. What are we going to do?" And he's like, "My hour has not yet come," meaning his hour to be poured out. He was pointing to ultimately the need, similar to wine being poured out. He would be poured out. But he ended up doing a miracle there. But then through the whole gospel, you hear this, "My hour's not yet come." And then there's references to the hour, when it will be, what the purpose of the hour is. And then in John 17:1, he actually says, "Father, the hour is here," right? So this is one chapter later, but it's still, John 17 is his priestly prayer. John 18 is his beginning of his arrest and trial. And so you look closer at this story and you don't see someone who's out of control. You don't see someone who's at the mercy of these religious leaders and these Roman soldiers, right? You get a picture of someone who very much was in control of this entire situation. And at the same time, you have, and I just wrestled through this passage, and I was like, sometimes narratives are a little bit harder to preach. Like, what's the thread? Where do you pull here? And I realized how much John was very clearly in this narrative contrasting sort of Jesus, who was very much in control and willing to be weak, and Peter, who thought he was in control but was actually really weak. And so there's two contrasting ideas we're just going to look at through this passage. Jesus' sovereign determination, I use that language intentionally, his sovereign determination in this whole process, and then secondly, Peter's self-serving denial. So Jesus was absolutely determined to go to the cross. He knew Judas would betray him. He knew Peter would deny him. He knew the other disciples would leave. And the big idea that captures this for today is that we deny Jesus to serve ourselves, but he denied himself to serve us. We deny Jesus to serve ourselves, but he denied himself to serve us. So we've all denied Jesus this week. And I know you're like, I don't remember that. You did. It's called sin. You may not have denied him publicly like Peter did, but all sin is a denial of Jesus as king. All sin is a denial to acknowledge his right to rule over your life and over everything. And so we've all denied him this week, but Jesus denied himself for us. So let's look at these. First, Jesus' sovereign determination, the first 14 verses here. And I use the word sovereign very intentionally. I know it's not something we use a lot but in our culture, but it means to be in supreme power or authority. And it may be a newer term for you if you're newer to church or newer to Christianity to hear this word sovereign applied to Jesus. But that connects with the whole imagery of Jesus, especially in the Gospel of Matthew, of the kingdom of God. And there's images throughout John as well. But Jesus is seen as a king who is coming into his kingdom, who is ushering in his kingdom. And indeed, the cross will actually be his enthronement. That will be his exaltation. I know that's crazy, but it's the opposite values of the kingdom of God, right? That through Jesus' weakness and humility, power came and salvation came to mankind. And so then he is able to say, he who loses his life will gain it. The one who's first will be last, but the last will be first, right? So the upside down values of the kingdom are seen in Jesus' sovereign enthronement on the cross. And throughout this passage and throughout the Gospel of John, there is no sense of a haphazard sort of just playing everything by ear movement to Jesus. So in verse 1 of 18, he's getting where Jesus and his disciples went to pray. John was there, so he says, they were in the Kidron, across the Kidron Valley. If you know Jerusalem at all or know that area, there's the Mount of Jerusalem and where the temple is, and then there's a valley to the east called Kidron, and then on the other side of that valley is the Mount of Olives, and on the Mount of Olives on the lower side was the Garden of Gethsemane. It was an olive grove. And this is where the setting in verse 2, Judas, who betrayed him, also knew that same place because evidently Jesus went there a lot to pray. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. I'm not 100% sure why. Still does not seem, Judas having walked with Jesus all these years, what in the world made him think, we better bring some weapons, guys? This guy's dangerous, right? And especially if you've seen him like calm storms and raise the dead and walk on water, you're kind of like, we better have some swords, Anyway, it just shows you how delusional he is in this moment. I mean, if I had seen Jesus do what he had done and I'm like, okay, we got to go arrest him, and the guys were carrying swords, I'd be like, have you got a tank? Maybe some gunships we could go in with, because this guy's a little different. Verse 4 gives us a huge statement. You can just read right over it. You may have not even noticed it when Edison read it a moment ago. But look, then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him. That is such a staggering statement. John is looking back, right? He's writing this decades later. He's looking back to help you and I as the readers to understand that Jesus knew this moment. He knew it would happen. He knew exactly how it would happen. He knew Judas would betray him. He knew that Roman soldiers would come. He knew representatives of the high priest would come. This was not a surprise. The hour had come. And Jesus was in complete sovereign control of the situation. Jesus is not a victim. He's a king carrying out his plan. So Jesus came, I love this. It doesn't say Jesus even waited. What does it say? It says, Jesus knowing what was going to happen, he waited around for them to. No, what does it say? He came forward. He literally walked towards the soldiers and Judas, right? They answered, and then asked who he was. Whom do you seek? Jesus, he knew who they sought. And Jesus set up this moment to confirm and to show who he was. So they answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus said to them, I am he. Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. So John's adding that just to make sure we know Judas is there. When Jesus said to them, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. I'll talk about that in just a moment. But imagine this scene. It's Judas, the Jew, who had been one of his disciples, right? along with the religious leaders, along with Roman soldiers. So you had like the world represented here. You had Jews, you had Gentiles, you had Romans, you had pagans, you had the Bible-thumping believers, and you had those who rejected sort of Judaism or one God. And this is a picture of the whole world basically coming to arrest Jesus, the whole world rejecting Jesus. In just a few moments, Jesus knew this, that not only would they arrest him, but Peter would betray him, right? Peter would deny him, and the rest of the disciples would leave as well, that he would be utterly alone. And Jesus, in the middle of this scene, is absolutely in control. Another clue is how he identifies himself in this moment in the response. So if you're reading along in the ESV Bible, it might have a footnote, but when he says to them, "I am he," we miss this in our English translation because it doesn't make sense if they translated it literally. It's not actually "I am he." It is the Greek ego eimi, I am. I am. And he says it twice. They ask him again. I don't know why they did after he knocked him over. But they come back asking for more. I am mirrors the references through the Gospel of John, right? I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I'm the resurrection and the life, right? All these references, I'm the good shepherd. And those point back to Exodus 3, God's great self-disclosure of himself to Moses at the burning bush, where Moses said, "Hey, I'm going to go into Egypt, and your people are there, and they're going to ask me what God is actually setting us free here, because Egypt has a bunch of gods." And God says, "Tell them, I am sent you." And so in this moment, Jesus is very purposefully invoking that image in that language. But what made them fall over? Well, there's some attempts to rationalize this, of course, because if you try to read the Bible anti-supernaturally and just purely materialistic explanations, you have to come up with something if this happened, right? It wasn't a miracle. It doesn't seem like a miracle. People falling over isn't a miracle if you didn't know that. But people just fell over. So why? Why did these people fall over? Well, it's the Mount of Olives, and there's kind of some steep areas there, and Jesus probably caught them off guard. And I guess evidently they were all tied together because they all collectively fell over as well. I'm just like, give up. Just admit that you don't like it. Don't try to make up stuff about it. What made them fall down? The best answer builds off the imagery that Jesus is very intentionally invoking. And maybe the best way to illustrate this would be when my girls were little, and I mean like 2 and 5, right? I would come home from the office, and they been gone all day, and come in, and they would attack me. Right? They would full on physically attack me, grab my legs, hugging me, and it would usually turn into some form of wrestling match. And I would end up, I would pretend fall on the ground or on the couch or whatever, and we would roll around. Now I'm 6'2" and I was about 205 at that point. Well, I won't say where I am today. But at 6'2" and 205, I was rolling around with the girls on the floor, and I had to be really careful, right? Like I couldn't swing my arm out. I couldn't let my weight fall on them. It would really hurt them. And so I was like showing restraint the entire time in that. And it's interesting, I couldn't, in essence, in biblical language, I couldn't show them my glory. Because the word glory in the Bible has a distinct connection with weight to it. It's where we get our terms, oh, that's weighty. Well, what does heavy mean, right? Heavy means there's a significance to it, and the glory of God is significant, so it's weighty. So I could not let my glory be revealed, or I could hurt them. In this moment, before Jesus was going to go to the cross and show the greatest weakness, he also wanted to make sure that he demonstrated that he was restraining his glory to them. He wanted them to see that this wasn't a guy who kind of lost and he died. Guy who had some success and he failed, right? Guy who was winning and then he gets killed, right? He is God in human form, who willingly restrained himself and his glory and his power to go to the cross. And so when he says, I am, he wanted to make sure there were no questions in the room. So he says, I am, and even in that, he also wanted to display this. Well, sorry, I love Tim Keller's quote here. He says, Jesus is saying, I'm the most powerfully weak person and the weakest powerful person in history. I'm exerting my strength and power as I become utterly and completely vulnerable. I love that. Such a beautiful image there. And so he's there with these hundreds of soldiers. And by the way, it's almost universally accepted that if they came with that many soldiers, the idea was to arrest Jesus and all of his followers, or at least all the core disciples. They were going to, this guy was trouble. They didn't want any of his disciples to make, kind of escape and start stirring up more trouble. So they were going to go and just arrest them all. And Jesus, what does he do? He says, you're not going to arrest any of these guys. And after he knocked them all over, I'm thinking they're like, okay. Okay, we'll listen to you on this one. But the point was that Jesus didn't want any of them to go to the cross with him because he came to die for his disciples, not with his disciples. And it needed to be clear that he was going to the cross by himself. He didn't even have a buddy to walk with him through that and to cheer him on and, hey, let's hang in there. And never underestimate Peter. What does Peter do in this moment? Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. There are all kinds of theories about that. How do you cut someone's ear off? Certainly not on purpose. Like, hold still, there's theories that Peter was actually left-handed because to cut off someone's right ear would be weird with a right hand. And so Peter was a fisherman. Don't think he was used to waving a sword around, but he was like, wait a minute, I'll stop this. And hundreds of Roman soldiers. I love Peter's heart, but Peter has inside thoughts that just sometimes come out in his words and actions. Isn't it interesting here, though, that Jesus actually, or John actually includes the name of the high priest's servant? Again, I would argue if you question the validity of the Bible, you question whether it's just made up myths, you don't include specific individuals' names and details like a left ear if you are making something up. You want it to be a little nebulous. You want it to be a little vague. You don't give the name of the guy who's still alive when you're writing this, so you could go talk to him and ask him about it or those who were there with him. Jesus calms down the situation. Luke 22 tells us he actually heals Malchus's ear. That's crazy. Again, everybody's like, okay. He's like, all right, I'm going to heal this guy's ear, but you're only going to take me. You're not going to take the rest of the guys. And they're like, okay. It's like is he a witch? They don't know. Like, these are Roman soldiers. They're not followers of Jesus, so they don't know what's happening, but they respect him. And then Jesus says to Peter, very importantly, reiterating again, I am in control of this moment. Put your sword in its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me? This is my cup to drink, Peter. This is the will of the Father. This is my will. And you're getting in the way. Well, it looks like weakness and loss is actually the Father's will. Jesus was not a king being captured. He was a king surrendering of his own will. So then contrasting that, we see the second part of our text, verses 15 through 27. We see Peter's self-serving denial. We all love Peter. Peter's that person who gets it right the third time, right? Anybody else like that? Experiential learners in the room, unite, raise your hand. But we love his heart. We love his heart. Earlier that same evening in John 13, he's in the upper room with his disciples, and this is where he washed their feet, and he institutes the Lord's Supper and all that kind of stuff, and he predicts Judas's betrayal, and then it says Satan entered Judas and he left. And then it's Jesus and his 11 disciples, and this is where he tells them, Peter, you're gonna deny me. And of course, Peter responds, I will lay down my life for you. Chapter 13, verse 37. Jesus answered, will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, the rooster will not crow till you have denied me 3 times. We need to see that Jesus knows us better than we do. Jesus knows you better than you do. You can either walk around life trusting in your own perception, or you can look to Jesus and let him help you to know you. I would argue there's a lot of like modern psychologies and things like that where we're, learning to understand ourselves and know ourselves, and that's a good thing. But knowing ourselves with ourselves is not the same thing as knowing ourselves with the sovereign God who knows us. Because he can help us see things we can never see by ourselves. He knows how you're going to blow it this week. Congratulations. He already knows. And he can help you to fight it if you're willing to acknowledge your self-confidence in your thinking is not nearly as helpful as confidence in him. Now, you would think that Jesus' warning would give Peter a heads up to be on alert. If somebody told you today, if I told you that God had revealed to me, and I was 100% confident that this was God's word, I would never say this to you, but if God had told me, you're going to deny Jesus 3 times before Wednesday, how would you go about work tomorrow? Like, especially if you kind of heard me and you're like, Blance never steered me wrong. Like, he said that. Like, what would that do? Would that not put up the alert radar? Especially the first time. First time at work, you're like, you deny, Jesus, and you're like, oh, I should go home. I mean, you don't want to reach that 3rd time. We don't know what happened to Peter. It just it just never connected with him, but it just reveals how in a moment, like you can start down a track that's really sad. Most of us would admit that there have been times we've told Jesus how much we love him. We've experienced his love and his joy and his peace, and we're just feel so close to him, and we're like, Jesus, I love you. Whatever you ask, wherever you ask, whenever you ask, I will obey you. I never would deny you. And only to find ourselves a short period of time later, falling into a sin, and we're like, what just happened, right? And so we've got to be a little sympathetic to him. But look at verse 15 to 27. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple, most people believe that this is John, that disciple was known to the high priest. He entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. So evidently John was very young when this was happening, and so maybe he was not seen as one of the main disciples. He wasn't a full-grown man or whatever in the same way Peter and James and other disciples were. And so, but he knew the high priest's guard, and they were like, hey, John, cool, come on in. And so he enters the courtyard with the high priest, but Peter stood outside at the door. Peter knew he was recognized. So the other disciple who was known to the high priest went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door, brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, you also are not one of the man's disciples, are you? He said, I am not. Now the servant and officer had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. And Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. Most people believe it was in the courtyard that Jesus was maybe even being tried, that, Peter was over on this other side, and he's observing, kind of watching things happening, and yet he's denying himself already, or denying it. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, I've spoken openly to the world. I've always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I've said. When he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, is that how you answer the high priest? I'm just like, Jesus, the ultimate comeback in this moment would be, is this how you answer God? I'm sorry. Jesus answered him, if what I said is wrong, bear witness about what's wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? He's just so good at asking questions. Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. Now, you're like, wait a minute, I thought Annas was the high priest. Caiaphas was the high priest. This was similar to like U.S. presidents. If you meet a former U.S. president, what do you address them by? Mr. You don't say Mr. Former President, you say Mr. President. And so in this case, Annas was the older high priest, and arguably maybe the power behind Caiaphas. He's retired, but you know how that goes. Annas, he was actually brought to Annas first, which tells you how much authority he had. Verse 25, now Simon was standing and warming himself, so they said to him, you also are not one of his disciples, are you? He denied it and said, I am not. One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, did I not see you in the garden cut off my cousin's ear? Sorry, that's my interpretation. Peter again denied it, and at once the rooster crowed. Now, at this moment, it's like Peter had dug himself into a hole. I think he was drawn because he loved Jesus and he wanted to see what was going to happen to Jesus, so he was drawn to that space. Because, I mean, ultimately self-preservation would say, this is bad, I'm going that way, right? Like he would have left, but he went because he loved Jesus. But this broke him. The other Gospels, Luke tells us he went out and wept bitterly. And the language there in Jewish culture would have been wailing. He was wailing. He was just weeping, inconsolable over this, that he had betrayed, denied Jesus. He had been so confident in asserting his willingness to follow Jesus anywhere, but when it came down to it, his self-preservation kicked in. What is your cost to not follow Jesus? I'm not talking about walking away from the faith for good. I'm not saying like, what would it take today for you to just give up Christianity? That's probably an important question for you to ask yourself. If you've not asked that and evaluated, what would it take for me to just go, I'm done with all this? I'm talking about the 1,000 little denials that we are tempted to every day and week of our lives. Talk about the momentary decision where you tell Jesus, nope, not now, not at this moment. Is it your reputation? Is it a relationship? Is it financial? Is it a moment at work where your faith or Christianity is brought up and you have an opportunity to give a kind and thoughtful response, but no, you're going to be outing yourself as a believer in that moment and you just choose to step back out of fear of other people and what they might say to you in that moment or that they might mock you later? And despite all your credentials and all the degrees you work for, they might think you're dumb. Answer that question for yourself. What is the cost, your cost, for denying Jesus? At what point would you put your self-preservation, your desires, your comfort, your other people, your career, or things in front of Jesus and deny that you and all that you have belong to him? That he is your king. What is the cost of denying Jesus as your king? In Luke 22, there are more things at work in this moment than we realize. In Luke 22, in a parallel account to John 13, Jesus actually tells Peter this. He says, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you that he may sift you like wheat. Satan demanded, he wanted Peter to deny Jesus. And we miss it in our translation, but the you in Luke is plural. Meaning, Satan wanted to sift Peter, wanted Peter so that he could sift all of the disciples. Sift like wheat. If you don't know that imagery, when they harvested wheat, they would cut the whole stalk, right? And they would take that, and then there was this process of sifting to get to the grain. The grain was heavy, and all the chaff would eventually sort of blow away through a long process until you had the grain. And Jesus is saying, Satan wants to sift you to see what's in you. I think Jesus still allows it. I think Satan wants to sift you this week. And Satan is smarter than you. All of you. He just is. The longer I'm a Christian, the more I know how well equipped he is to trip up Christians. He doesn't come with a huge compromise. Listen, he does not show up at work this week in a coworker who stops by your desk and says, hey, do you want to do some black tar heroin in the bathroom with me? I mean, if that's a temptation for you, you should definitely be ready for that. But I'm thinking most of us would not have any problem at all going, no, thank you. And I'm going to report you to HR. And pray for you. That's not how he shows up. He shows up through those tiny decisions. He knows he can't get you to do this. He'll get you to do this. And he'll get you to string a few of those together. Little denials, little not acknowledging who you are as a Christian in your workplace, just kind of hiding that, being low-key, clandestine. I feel called to be a secret agent Christian in my workplace where no one knows that I'm following Jesus. No. And these compromise and denials become easier and easier and easier until if you belong to Jesus, he'll break you just like he broke Peter because he loves you. Because he loves you and he needs you to see that you're trusting in yourself and your own self-preservation. You're not denying yourself, taking up your cross and following Jesus. You're living for yourself, denying Jesus and ignoring your cross. Listen, we are given countless opportunities to deny out of self-preservation or pleasure. And some of them are more public than others, and some implications are more costly. Some of you in your school or workplace, as soon as you kind of are outed as a Christian, you know it's going to cost you. I just want to challenge you. Are you going to live by faith or are you going to live by fear? Because one of the things that Peter did not understand in this moment, I just want to make this abundantly clear. Peter was taking the path of self-preservation because that's where he thought rest lied, right? He did not understand that Jesus was more in control of that moment that he could possibly understand, and that if he rested in Jesus, he wouldn't have to worry about anything. We can look at folks like Ryan and Laura and think of course, they have to decide to live by faith and not by fear, right? Lord has sent them where they are and to make Jesus known and the people they reach. These people often take their lives into their own hands. They might get denied. They might get excommunicated from their entire family, cast out by their entire family. They may face physical persecution, certainly social persecution over their faith, right? And while we don't face that, we may very well face other kinds: aggression, hatred, ridicule. But we miss the point. We look at Ryan and we look at and Laura and we look at the others that are doing this, and we look at the people that he shared the stories about, and we think, wow, aren't they great? They're living by faith. I believe in Jesus as God's global economy. He places people on purpose. And you are no less placed here at this moment than they are placed where they are at this moment. You are to live for the glory of God and to make the name of Jesus known. They are to live for the glory of God and to make Jesus known. They just have harder decisions to make every day, so it kind of purifies their faith a bit. We can hide out because there's just enough comfort here to avoid it. Will you embrace fear or will you embrace faith? Peter thought his denial in the moment was his safest bet, but his safest bet would have been to trust Jesus as his king. Despite Peter's denial and our denial, the good news of Christianity is we are not treated by God based on our denial. God does not respond to our denial in how he treats us. Thank God our denial doesn't have the last word. It grieves the Spirit. I believe it grieves Jesus when we disown him, we deny him. But the gospel is the good news that sin doesn't have the last word. Not before you become a Christian, and certainly not after you've become a Christian. Jesus was willing to be denied by Peter so Peter would never be denied by God. And Jesus was willing to be denied by you and I so that you and I will never be denied by God. That's the glory of the gospel. That's the good news. And so when you think of Jesus going to the cross, this wasn't circumstances that just got out of control. This is a king's plan and strategy for yours and my redemption. And as we fix our eyes on him and we see his faithfulness to the cross, he will be faithful to us and allow us and help us to be able to be faithful to him in our culture, in our time, in our spaces that we are in. The question, though, this week is, what will rule you, fear of man or faith in Jesus? And I want to encourage you. You probably have already thought of ways that you've been hiding your faith, not using opportunities the Lord gives you. And I want to encourage you, don't just push that down just because, I'm thankful for grace. I'm thankful for grace. Bring that up, confess it to Jesus. He knows it. And then ask him to help you this week to live by faith. We're going to close with a time of communion and response. There's people to pray with you by the window over here, and I just want to encourage you, wherever you are today spiritually. It doesn't matter whether you've been a Christian for 30 years or whether you are not even a Christian. There are people here that want to intercede for you. Maybe you're struggling with something. Maybe you have a friend that's struggling with something. Maybe you just kind of need to tell someone else you have been denying Jesus and have them pray for you. And listen, these people love to pray. Their joy is to intercede for you and I. They were praying in the prayer room this morning. It was actually full. It was beautiful, seeing so many people in there. And so I encourage you during this time, through the rest of the service and afterwards, that prayer team will be over there. Communion is, our baptism is our way we identify with Jesus' family initially. It is that sign of being joined into Jesus' family. For some of you, the next step of faith for you is to be baptized. And you can mark that on your connection card that you want to know more about baptism, and we can follow up with you about that. Communion, which we're about to take, is a weekly reminder we take, a physical reminder of the body and blood of Christ. Jesus said, if you take and eat, this is my body broken for you. Drink, this is my blood poured out for you. Do this as often as you will in remembrance of me. Drink the cup is the new covenant. So Jesus wanted to make sure we didn't miss that. So it's not just an idea, but a physical act that you and I join in to remind ourselves that Jesus will never deny us. And he has staked his name and his glory on that. So prepare yourself in your seat, or as we're singing this next song. And as a Christian, anytime over this next song, we invite you to step out and take communion at one of the stations. And if you're not a Christian, this is communion is the one part we'd ask you to not take baptism as your next step. So let's go ahead and stand together. I'll pray, and then we can respond. Jesus, I thank you for your word today. Without eyewitness accounts of what happened and without your inspiration, we would not know exactly how in control you were. As it wasn't the Jews or the Romans that executed you. It was your will to go to the cross. You chose weakness that we might be made strong. Forgive us for the countless times we choose sin over you, denying you as our King. And I pray that even today as we take communion, we are reminded of the grace you have for us and empower us to live this week. In your great name we pray. Amen.